Okay, it's time to start. So, gentlemen, I'll ask you to mute yourself when you're not speaking, just to avoid the background noise. And I guess we can start. Be sharp in time. Welcome everyone to the web discussion. Well, that's the fourth and the last in the series of cyber diplomacy web discussion, at least for now. This one focusing on norms and confidence building measures with the question, are we there yet? Those of you that are Smurfs know the question, are we there yet? The webinar is the fourth in the series of cyber diplomacy web discussions organized by DiploFoundation with support of Microsoft. The series focuses on the risks for international peace and security stemming from cyberspace and hosted a number of distinguished international discussants as today as well. My name is Vladimir Radunovic. I'll host and the moderator of the discussion today. With me, I also have Ms. Andriana Gavrilovic, who will help with the moderation of the chat discussion. So we'll try to ensure that all the questions and comments are fed into the discussion in the right moment. The rules of the games, for those that are new to our webinars, is the audio-video discussion with the guests. But then the inputs from all of you, the participants, are welcomed at any moment through the chat window. There is no Q&A moment, so simply post your questions, comments at any point, and you can also run the discussions in parallel in the chat, and we'll try to feed that into the discussion if you wish. The webinar is being broadcasted on YouTube. It's being recorded as well, so the recording and the summary will be available after the webinar in a couple of days. The recordings and the summaries of the previous three webinars are already there. The introduction for those that are new to Diplo, we are an international education institution. We deliver a lot of capacity building and academic programs related to diplomacy. Among other, we cover policy aspects of cybersecurity, of course, and particularly international debates on peace and security. Our main work is done through the research and the observatory. And again, you're invited to visit the Digital Watch Observatory. We'll share the link in the chat. We do a lot of online courses. We currently have an online course on cybersecurity, which is in the week where we discuss the international peace and security. And we just had a session with about 15, 20 participants around the world. So this will be a natural continuation of that. I welcome them if they're also if they've joined. Brief context of the webinar today. In the previous three webinars, we have run through the trends in cyber-armament, the trends in waging cyber attacks, states against the state actors related to states, and so on. We have run through the challenges of the applicability of international law to cyberspace, and finally we have run through the complexities of attribution or accusation, pointing the finger, the consequences, and so on. And today we actually focus on the norms and confidence measures. So sort of the framework for responsible behavior of states, also other actors in cyberspace. And we have witnessed a number of now also successful attempts within the United Nations, in particular, the group of governmental experts, and now the new established open-ended working group, and some of the norms that emerged from the GGE process. Then the regional organizations like the Organization for Security and Cooperation of Europe, the Asian Regional Forum, and so on. We have seen the attempts or the work of the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace, Microsoft norms, Carnegie and David Paris Call, Tech Accord, a number of proposals for voluntary norms and confidence building measures. So the question is, does that work? How does that work? Is that sufficient? Do we need more norms, more rules? How do we implement them? That's probably one of the trickiest things. How do we actually implement the framework? And then where do these discussions take place? How can we all participate in shaping the framework? So this webinar, last in this series of cyber diplomacy discussions, will look into the importance of norms and confidence building measures and go over already existing norms and CBMs in cyberspace. With me, I have two distinguished guests, Abdul Hakim Ajijola, who is the commissioner, or was the commissioner, of the Global Commission for Stability of Cyberspace. He's also an executive chairman of Consultancy Support Services Ltd, based in Abuja, if I'm not wrong. And he has sort of a mixture of backgrounds. He is, with one hat, in the private sector, with the other hand, is deeply involved in the shaping of the norms and the diplomatic discussions, if you wish. And then next to him, to my left, I think to your left as well, is Bart Hogeven. He's head of cyber capacity building at the International Cyber Policy Center, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI. Bart was also involved in the diplomatic negotiations with the Dutch heads to some extent, and is also very, very deeply involved in following all the global discussions. So let me start briefly, or maybe with the initial question, and I'll start with Bart. I might put some of the slides. Thank you again for putting some of the slides on. Arvin, I guess you can put on the first slides, and then I'll just lightly run through the slides, but we are not going to focus on them. The first question is, what are actually the norms and confidence building measures? Does it matter on a global scale? What is why do we have them? What's the point of all of that? Bart, maybe quickly first to you.
Sure. Thanks, Vlada, for that introduction and for passing first to me. I think that's an excellent question. Actually, why do we have these norms? And I guess the answers have come from the previous sessions that you run, when you talk about in particular trends in armaments, issues around attribution, and kind of how to manage that, and how to respond as an international community to increased armaments that amongst states, but also amongst non-state actors. So why these norms? It's not just the norms, evidently, and I think that's the sequence of your sessions actually are reflective of this. That it's a kind of a framework, and the UN calls it the UN Framework for Responsible State Behavior in Cyberspace, which consists of the application of international law that you talked about previously, 11 norms of responsible state behavior, confidence building measures that we'll touch on today as well, and finally cyber capacity building, and doing that in a coordinated fashion. Now, why we have these norms? I think as we have, let's say, seen these developments over the last 10 to 15 years, we see things happening in the world which are sometimes positive, sometimes negative. And these norms help us to kind of draw a line between what behavior from states do we find acceptable or responsible, and which acts of states do we find less responsible or irresponsible, if you will. So these norms kind of help us define the boundaries of what is acceptable behavior. They're not law, so they don't kind of tell you what you can't do or what you cannot do. But I mean, if you look at the official language, it talks about should and shouldn't be doing. So the norms are a way or a part of a framework that helps define what we as the international community feels is responsible behavior of states.
Let me focus briefly on. So you made a good relation between these components of international law, capacity building, norms, confidence building measures, and so on. Now, Abdul Hakim, I know that since you were working in the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace, you also had some sort of the showing of what are the major components basically of this let's say international framework, and how do the norms and CBMs actually fit into all of that? Abdul Hakim.
No, I'm not muted.
So,
can you hear me?
Now it's fine.
Okay,
yep.
Good. Okay. So I think one of the takeaways we have to keep in the back of our mind is that facts, numbers, facts don't change minds. What changed minds is friendship, and that is friendship, in the foundation of trust. How do you get trust? Well, it's about integrity and transparency. So I think that's what we're all trying to achieve, to build those bridges of friendship and trust, whether it is using confidence building measures or to reinforce the norms. Now, having said that, in terms of the Global Commission, there's a lot of overlap, obviously, with what Bart has said, but we look at the cyber stability framework that we have put together. Basically is based on adherence to international law, the technical standards. We've articulated a set of principles, some of which also Bart has touched on. Again, the capacity building is sine qua non, as they say. Without it, nothing else works. The confidence building measures, and then you have the voluntary norms, and then the notion of multi-stakeholder engagement. I think these are basically the essence of the frameworks that we have looked at articulating.
Now, looking at, I liked what you mentioned, that the goal is actually building trust and friendship, if you wish, whether there are friendships on the international cooperation level, but anyhow, the trust definitely. So I wanted to, before going in depth into what norms we have already as part of the framework and within the UNGG and what are the proposals of the Global Commission and others, I wanted to come back to the two levels. So to what extent we can expect the norms and CBMs can actually help the relations between the big powers, mainly P5 and nuclear powers, big powers, US, Russia, China, and so on. And to what extent they can actually help on the more sort of a regional level, because we know that most of the conflicts actually are not among the big powers, at least not directly, but are in Africa and Middle East and so on. So maybe, Bart, firstly, back to you. The CBMs, the norms, the concept of CBMs and norms, it didn't emerge with cyberspace, right? It's something that existed before. Can we expect that this can help the relations between the big powers in sense of the rules of the game in cyberspace?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two questions, right, in what you just mentioned. One is it did not emerge out of nothing, just in relation to cyberspace. Plus the question whether it only kind of moderates the behavior between big powers. So evidently, now sitting here in Australia, of course, one of the first regions that we look at is Southeast Asia, and if you look at what they have been doing in terms of getting to norms, but also establishing confidence building measures between the states in the region. One of the examples is the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is if I'm not mistaken, a 25 or 27 member state organization. And the organization in itself is one big confidence building measure, as they say. It's being having states being part of a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue, and being able to provide reassurances to one another that there are no bad intentions amongst them, and if there would be, let's say, external threats, that they can be faced in a collaborative way. So I kind of want to pick up on the point that Abdul Hakim made when he talked about, let's say, friendship. I think one of the terms that we have been coining a few times here is, let's say, the term of reassurance. The norms and confidence building measures are mainly about reassuring other states, or when we talk about, let's say, interstate relations, or other actors of good intentions. Then going back to your question, is this only a matter of concern for the big powers? I think there are two answers to that. One is when we talk, let's say, kind of major potential cyber conflict, that's most likely to be be linked to the big cyber powers. But I think as we have seen on a number of occasions, the fallout also falls with smaller nations, oftentimes developing countries or developing economies, who either be a conscious or unconscious victim of things happening between other countries. And just a clear example here in the region is the case of Indonesia. I think Indonesia is the number one and number two countries from where cyber attacks are being launched or being received. That's not because Indonesia is a bad actor, it's simply because its infrastructure is being misused. And just given the size and the maturity of the country, they're not, let's say, fully able to contain or to exercise kind of their powers over their internet infrastructure. So just to make sure that other countries don't see Indonesia as a bad actor, it's very important to have these norms and confidence building measures to ensure that assistance can be provided, that information can be shared, and that there is a collective effort in mitigating the worst kinds of cyber attacks or cyber incidents. And so I think that's where these norms and CBMs come into play. And if we had a look at, let's say, at the Council of Foreign Relations cyber operations tracker, and if you look there, you can actually find that all of the ASEAN member states, all of them, from the smallest and the least developed economy to the more mature ones, have all experienced what I call the kind of national security ICT incident in the last 10 years. So it's a concern to all nations, small, large, developed, developing, big economy, or developing economy.
So I guess we can actually say that the role of the CBMs and norms should be to avoid misunderstanding, to avoid the escalation, as you gave the example of Indonesia, to actually know that the country is committed to peace, but then we should jointly resolve the problems which might emerge from the network. Now, one of the things we mentioned in the previous webinar, talking about the attribution or accusations, is that again we usually focus on the big powers, and thanks Bart for putting it down to the regional level a bit more. Most of the conflicts are not among the big powers, and then the smaller countries are in a way following the big powers in both the cyber armament trends, if we wish, and also to a large extent in the agreements regarding the applicability of international law, and then the norms and CBMs. If there are no CBMs and norms that are agreed or implemented by smaller nations in the region where the conflict is either bound or it's there or it might happen, what can happen? Can cyber attack be the trigger? Could it be a cause of misunderstanding? Could it be a cause of escalation? Abdul Hakim.
Well, I think definitely anytime you have a forest that is a tinderbox, any spark, it doesn't matter where the spark comes from, can trigger an inferno. And I'd like to build upon something that Bart had mentioned in terms of some of the smaller countries. I think we have to realize that, and I speak as somebody coming from the developing world and from the African continent, we face a number of additional issues, or I don't know if they're additional, but they seem additional to us. One of them, frankly, is cost. Anytime you want to implement a norm, for example, there is going to be an inherent cost of capacity building. There's going to be an inherent cost of change management, building trust among those, the capacity and trust among those who are even going to discuss the norms, those who are going to apply the norms. In addition to this, we have challenges such as mistrust, because sometimes smaller countries or less endowed countries also mistrust the motives of those countries that are a little better off, or the bigger countries. Then we also ask ourselves, what's this guy, or what are these big guys trying to do with regards to our sovereignty? So these are some of the challenges that we also ask ourselves. And then I think while this may apply to a lesser degree in other areas or in other states, I think a lot of the states in the global south have a lot of uncertainty about digitization anyway. We are not as far along as some of the larger countries and some of the countries in the geopolitical West, for example. And so I think, especially among the African states, we're a bit worried about some of these norms, some of these principles, some of these multilateral treaties and how to apply them. Like I said, it's cost, it's questions of trust, it's questions of sovereignty, questions of uncertainty about digitization as a whole.
It is a good point on to what extent the lack of trust could actually endanger the whole process of digitalization, or the whole process of moving ahead with new technologies and trust into their use, particularly in developing countries. Let us move on to the framework. So looking into what do we actually have now? The first question is, do we have sort of a widely accepted, agreed upon international framework for responsible behavior? And what are those norms that we already have maybe a wider agreement about, or the norms that are proposed, including by the Global Commission, many others, and what are some of the CBMs that we are talking about? So, but looking into the norms that we have on the UN level, can we say that we have some sort of we can get back to CBMs a bit later. Can we say that we have some sort of the agreement, and that this will be helpful in raising trust among the various players? Right.
Well, I think one thing you can say is that the 11 norms that were listed in the 2015 report of the UN Group of Governmental Experts have been kind of globally endorsed through a UN General Assembly resolution. So de facto, or in principle, at least all 193 member states have endorsed those 11 norms. Now that said, if you would let to run a questionnaire globally, as to kind of who knows what are these 11 norms, then I think you will get a pretty poor result. So yes, technically there is global endorsement of these norms, but how that works out in practice, I think that's the main challenge which lies in front of us, and which, as far as I understand, is probably the key question for the current GGE and the current open-ended working group. I think referring back to some of the questions or comments that you made previously is I mean, it's pretty easy to kind of say, yes, we agree to these 11 norms, and if you look, let's say, to what's actually written there, then there isn't that much contentious material in there. The trick, of course, will be in how do states read, apply, and implement those norms. And that's, I think, the trick with any kind of international negotiated text, is that everyone is happy with it, and it at the same time it contains so many ambiguities that when we start, let's say, into the implementation phase, lots of these ambiguities need to be tackled again. Now, I also want to kind of maybe post this as a comment, or maybe as a hypothesis. Is if you look at these 11 norms, there isn't that much contentious material in there. So let's say look at the first norm, which says states should cooperate with one another. Well, that's kind of very obvious. If you look at the second norm, which talks about attribution, you've talked about that previously. The norm says, please look at all the information that you have available, and kind of what I would say, don't jump to conclusions. I think there is no actor, whether that's state or non-state, who would disagree with these kind of norms. Then again, how do you kind of encourage states that have not been intensely part of the debate so far? How do you kind of ensure them that this is not something that's being developed by a UN, let's say, level body, and then imposed on the member states, but actually it's a reflection of what's kind of common best practice. And I think so. We've been doing some kind of capacity building work in Southeast Asia around, let's say, the implementation of these norms. And if you go into a discussion with member states, so with people from foreign ministries, but also from the national cybersecurity agencies, from their police organizations, etc., you actually find that most countries are already doing quite a bit in terms of implementation. They just don't frame it as such, because most states are working on either a cybersecurity law, legislation, or strategy which contains different aspects which are parts of several norms. Most countries by now have a cert capability and have a certified cert capability. So I think, let's say, lots of things are happening there. It's just not being kind of framed as a way of implementing the bulk of these norms. So two elements to it. Yes, there is an agreement. Knowledge about what these norms are and what they mean is, I think, very marginal. But at the same time, I think if we look, let's say, at the tactical level about what's happening in almost all countries, whether that's kind of in developed economies or in developing states or in the global south, I think there is much more that we can see and identify than meets the first eye.
Thanks for the overview. There are a couple of comments in the chat. I'll bring them a little bit later, Abdul Hakim, if you agree. Before running into how different parts of the world, including Africa, actually look at the norms and whether they know enough and what's the relation with the existing documents like the African Convention on Cybersecurity, I wanted to look firstly a little bit more into the norms. So, Bart, you mentioned that a number of them are something that should probably be taken for granted, that the countries should cooperate, that they should assist each other in case of incidents, and so on and so forth, to prevent cybercrime and so on. There are a couple of them, however, which are explicitly saying what shouldn't be done, such as harming the infrastructure, critical infrastructure, not using, misusing, or attacking the computer incident response teams, and so on. Abdul Hakim, since you basically come from private sector, and for you, many of them might be, that's a question, might be even strange, why are the diplomats agreeing that they should cooperate? What would you single out, or what norms you would particularly look into, saying that they might be useful or add value to the whole discussion, and probably not just to the governments, but also something that the other stakeholders should look more into? Abdul Hakim.
Commission and the norms that we have articulated, I think we are heartened and pleased to find that, for example, the Paris Call, about 5 out of our 8 norms is embedded in the Paris Call, including our flagship norm, which is protection of the public core. Also, the protection of the public core norm is also now embedded as part of the European Union Cybersecurity Act. So at least it's in European legislation, and given the influence of European legislation globally, one would argue that it has gotten sufficient traction to become literally a global norm. And then finally, very quickly, the tech accords, I think, have at least 4 or 5 of our norms. Now, very quickly, in terms of your question about what norms does the private sector find of great interest, at least from my perspective, one of the key norms, I think, is the norms on the misuse of computer emergency response teams. If I may just characterize them as a teaching hospital. So a computer emergency response team, like a teaching hospital, does capacity building, new doctors and nurses, does research, new types of surgery, probably research on vaccines. Now, in addition to that, obviously, it treats patients. And any of those functions or capacities that you find in a teaching hospital arguably could be relatively easily weaponized. And so I think it's very important from a private sector perspective that we make sure that our national, because certs, they're not always government, but there tends to be a large number of them that are, especially the coordinating certs, that are government owned. And while the certs, that is the teaching hospitals, are government owned, most of the infrastructure is privately owned, which means that if the certs were to be used for abuse or used as a launch pad for attack, they would actually attack through private sector pipes. So I think from a private sector perspective, one is very, very, very anxious that this kind of norm gets some traction. I also think that the norm on especially the Global Commission norm on no hackback, really, this is a norm against calling for no offensive cyber operations. Again, if you look back in history, the era of the Wild Wild West actually helps no one. And an economy, a business, actually requires, even a disruptive and innovative business requires some level of stability, not stagnation, but stability in the sense of trust and some level of predictability. So I think these are some of the areas that from a private sector perspective, we're very, very concerned about. And if I may just add, one of the norms that's from the Global Commission that I particularly like is basically the norm for basic hygiene as a foundational defense. And I think the interesting thing I find about this norm is that it puts the onus on all of us, whether you are as an individual, as a corporate or public sector organization, or as a nation state, as a society, to basically do some things for ourselves, to take some responsibilities for ourselves. And sorry, I did say finally, but if I could just add, the Global Commission norm on the vulnerabilities equities process, I think this is also quite crucial because as we found with the leaked reports by, or alleged reports by Edward Snowden, that certain caches of flaws and tools to exploit, certain cyber capacities were being held by the government in secret. And of course, when these tools and this knowledge about the flaws leaked, then it leaked first and foremost to the bad guys who now used it to take advantage of the rest of us. I'll stop there for a moment.
Thanks. I'm looking at the questions, and thanks, Nicholas, Connie. We'll get back to these questions also in a minute. Quick clarification, maybe, Abdul Hakim. So the difference between the GG norms and the Global Commission norms or any other norms is that the GG norms or the UN GG norms have been agreed and went to the General Assembly of the United Nations. So we can say that all the UN states actually agree on these norms, whether they are voluntary and whether they're actually going to implement it. That's a different thing. What is the process, or at least the nice wish or the intention of the Global Commission and probably others that are working on proposed norms to actually make those proposals that you have also part of the global discussion? How does that work, and what is your experience on actually putting the new norms or the ideas into the diplomatic process for real?
Well, I think the bottom line wish is that these norms become owned, that people like you, myself, Bart, and others, people listening here, actually own these norms. And when you say own in the broad sense, means that you take them to heart, you read them, you understand them, and of course you apply them and you abide by them. Whether this is done formally through the UN or not, what is important is they get traction. Having said that, obviously going through the UN process is what I call the formal platform and probably the more ideal route. But at the end of the day, really what you want is for people to own these norms. So if they contribute to the conversations at the UN, then I think that's an excellent thing. And if they don't, but people still find ways, formally, informally, of adopting them, that's also good, because what you find in other situations, you might have, for example, I mean, look at a very good example, the European GDPR. Once Europe agreed on a set of data regulations, basically, and again, there might be some debate about this, but basically they became global norms. Now, they didn't necessarily go through the UN. And I think what's important is that they are adopted, trusted, and used. This, I think, is the bottom line takeaway.
Bart, I don't know if you want to add anything.
I think I largely agree with Abdul Hakim what he just mentioned, is that it's nice kind of when norms or agreements are kind of endorsed at the UN level or in nice forums like in Paris. But I think the real test obviously is what the most important kind of actors or stakeholders actually do in practice. So if, for instance, the global main cybersecurity companies take these norms to heart, then that's already a success factor. If individual countries kind of take reference to the norms, whether that's the GGE norms or the Tech Accord norms or the GCSE norms, that's the plus. So I think we shouldn't, let's say, stare blind on kind of what has been agreed by all governments, but actually try to look at what's the practice and what kind of critical mass around different sets of norms is forming, and that will take time. I think that's also important to realize that it will take time, years, for these norms to mature, to become part of what we are going to find normal in the end.
I guess one of the questions.
If I may just quickly add. Yeah, sorry. Just to support what Bart is saying, the norms relating to, I think, nuclear proliferation took 50 years to become international law. Obviously, we're not looking forward to 50 years, but my point is that we do have to have some level of patience, and it's a process, not necessarily a destination.
Well, yeah, hopefully we're not looking into 50 years. The technology advances so fast that we probably have just 10 or so. No, but one good question, which I'm actually saving for a bit later when we move into the implementation, or how do we focus on that, and that's where we will also look into all these questions from the chat, is if some number of countries endorse and follow the norms and CBMs and the others don't, then the others might have the advantage because they can still hack the certs and the critical infrastructure and so on. So what is the reward for adhering to the norms if the others are not, and so on? But I park it for within a couple of minutes. But before that, I'm going back to Nicola's question on trying to distinguish between the norms and the CBMs. So what are the norms and the CBMs? I don't know, Bart, if you wish to briefly cover what are the CBMs, what are the confidence building measures, and what is what do we have currently out of the CBMs, and what is the difference between the CBMs and the norms? But
yeah, thanks, Vlad. I was already afraid that you were about to pass that question to me. And I think I would suggest to give two answers. One is when I kind of introduced kind of this framework of international law, the norms, the confidence building measures, and capacity building, even though they're kind of specific terms, they all also fit together as well. So you can't always clearly distinguish between what is a norm, what is a confidence building measure, and what constitutes capacity building, and what eventually maybe matures as international law. So I think that's one part of the answer I wanted to give, because if you look again, let's say on a level deeper of each and every norm that we discussed, whether that's the GGE norms or the GCSE norms, if you look at practical examples of what implementation could look like, you end up with similar examples as you would expect to be categorized as confidence building measures. But I think largely, what's the difference between norms and confidence building measures? I would say you need confidence building measures or confidence building or confidence between the main stakeholders, and in this case around ICT security in an international context, before being able to actually go into a conversation about what is responsible and irresponsible behavior. In other words, what are the norms? So you need kind of practical measures that ensure that states and actors and private sector who are talking with one another have a sufficient degree of confidence in each other before being able to eventually agree on these are the norms and we will implement those. So that's part of, let's say, what the confidence building measures obviously do. And then also in terms of a latent conflict or a potential crisis, these confidence building measures allow actors who might be, let's say, at odds with one another, to kind of, well, then there's the famous example of obviously of the red phone between the Kremlin and the White House, where they can call one another and say, actually, what's going on? Are you deliberately targeting us? If yes, please stop. And if no, what is this other third party? Who is it, and what might be their intention? How do we mitigate a potential crisis situation, or how to contain it? So two answers again. It's all part of the same package, and there will be quite some degrees of overlap between what confidence building measures constitute and what norms constitute and what international law implies. But then more in simple terms, confidence building measures are more practical, less normative, if you will, and allow you to enter into a conversation with your potential adversaries as well.
Hakim.
I think more personal to me. I tend to look at norms as a little more strategic in nature. For example, if you go through a religious text, there's a norm: "Thou shalt not kill." But how does the preacher basically reach out to the congregation to get the message across? And this is where the preacher's confidence-building measures, which are, for me, the tactical component, facilitate the message of the norm, "Thou shalt not kill," getting to the congregation. So I'll leave it at that.
No, actually, I guess that's a good example, and I guess the CBMs, as you mentioned, but are more of the lower level practical measures to reduce the misunderstanding when there might be misunderstanding. Well, the norms might be simply, please don't attack these and these targets, or please cooperate. But this one is, let's say that you all want to avoid the conflict. Make sure that we know what we are talking about, and reduce the potential of unfortunate conflict because we don't understand each other. Within the OSCE confidence building measures, there are a couple of which are focusing on the compiling the common terminology, or not the common, but the terminology across the states, who means what when they say cyber attack, cyber security, information security, and so on and so forth, who has which institutions in place, and the mechanism on a national level, which are the main contact points, and so on and so forth, so that it actually reduces the chance of a misunderstanding. I think it's particularly relevant for the smaller regions, well, for the big ones, as you mentioned, but the red phone as well. But for the smaller regions where, as you mentioned, Abdul Hakim, anything can actually be a spark to cause the fire. And cyber attack can equally become a spark. So that's something to be aware. Okay, I think it's the right moment to actually move into the question of, so how do we do that? That's all fine. We have all this together. We can all agree or start implementing. But that's all voluntary. That's all something. It might be a wishful thinking. Piece of letters, or number of letters on paper. How do we actually implement them? There were a couple of interesting comments in the chat. One was related to the focus was obviously on Africa. To what extent there is the involvement of African, not just African, diplomats, stakeholders in general, in the whole processes? To what extent the other countries than the usual suspects or developed ones have awareness about the process, have resources to follow that, have resources to implement actually what is agreed. If they are part of the process, then they might actually feel the ownership, and they might want to invest more. But then again, the question is to what extent the CERT knows what's happening, and all these actors. So maybe, it's a general question. Well, let's start with that. What are the key bullet points, if you wish, that we should take into account when it comes to the implementation? But
well, thanks, Vlada. I think the first point I would like to make is and you've been using those terms in this discussion as well, that norms, but also the confidence building measures are voluntary and non-binding agreements. And even though that's technically true, obviously, I mean, they don't constitute international law, but I think I would pose the statement that even though they're technically non-binding and voluntary, in fact, the fact that they have been agreed by a large group of countries and have a large kind of ownership base, relatively, does mean that there is some kind of compelling factor to be in conformity with these norms and confidence building measures. And I've heard, let's say, also in kind of my part of the world, people using the term non-binding and voluntary as a kind of excuse, saying, well, if they're voluntary and non-binding, then we don't have to do anything. And I think that's personally not true. So I think the key things here are being able to operationalize these norms and confidence building measures and kind of the international text which captures the essence of those agreements, and make them to the extent possible context appropriate for different contexts, and being able to operationalize those. Now those are kind of some catchy phrases, but again, I think if you're going to look at each and every norm and confidence building measure and start to think of examples of what actually constitutes adoption and implementation, you will end up finding, I think, very concrete, very practical steps that I would assume that maybe 80% of the countries worldwide are already doing. Most countries have some kind of cybercrime legislation in place. Most countries have a national government cert with assigned roles and responsibilities. Most countries have international missions in New York and in Geneva and at the African Union headquarters, who are in continuous contact with one another and talk about a whole range of issues, including ICT security issues. So lots of things are already happening, and I think it's a matter of kind of making sure that what's happening, that is well captured and also becomes part of the norms kind of dialogue. And I agree, I think, with some of the comments made earlier, is that you've got, let's say, these high-level international agreements have been developed and matured in a different part of the, have not, let's say, included parts of society who are actually, let's say, with the feet on the ground and working on cybersecurity. And I think it's a matter of bringing those two together. Plus, I think, and that's a comment to, I think, your first question, Vlada, was norms and confidence building measures are nothing new and are nothing unique to cyber. Actually, they have been in place from the moment that the nation states were developed and started to kind of make war, but also make peace. And I think the key here is also to ensure that kind of existing mechanisms of interstate cooperation, of confidence building measures, of dialogues, of joint exercises, that the ICT component is becoming part of that rather than something separate and something very distinct. And maybe again an example of the ASEAN Regional Forum, that is one big confidence building measure which talks about maritime security, which talks about climate security, which talks about transnational organized crime, and it also talks about ICT incidents. And there's same mechanisms to ensure that information is shared, that countries kind of inform one another of their legislation and how they do things domestically, are being used or should ideally be used for issues related to international peace and security and cybersecurity as well. So I think those are a few things which are not, let's say, mechanisms of enforcement, but everyone who's been working in international affairs knows that nothing ever, let's say, was enforced, and still we have a system of international peace and stability in place, which relies on voluntary and to an extent binding agreements between states.
Bart, before passing floor to Abdul Hakim, there was a question by Christian. Do norms become customary international law to some extent, even if when we adopt them we agree that these are not international law? But do they sort of become the customary international law?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but my argument would be that over time norms can become customary international law, and I think that's a kind of and that's again why the application of international law, the norms and the CBMs are all part of, let's say, the same package. So norms can become customary international law, but I think for the moment they mostly are a reflection of common state practice, which is customary international law to a great extent. But it doesn't mean that and I think that's another probably good thing to highlight as well. It doesn't mean that bad things aren't happening. There is the norm and the international legal obligation not to interfere, not for one state to interfere in the domestic affairs of another state. At the same time, we know that this is happening as well. But the norms and the confidence building measures allow you to kind of hold other actors or other states to account. So at least there is a common understanding that it's not something legitimate. It doesn't mean it's not going to happen.
Abdul Hakim, I'm sure you have a number of reflections on that, but also try to reflect a little bit on how do we make sure that developing countries, okay, we can focus on Africa, but definitely it's not just Africa, get more informed and involved about the processes they should take part and interested to basically become part of either the UN processes or African processes or other maybe multi-stakeholder processes related to that. Hakim.
Okay. I think, first of all, I would like to look at, in addressing your question, look at it through the prism of people, process, and technology. All these things we were talking about really are for people, by people, and about people. And so when we start with people in the PPT framework, we're really looking at capacity building, be it advocacy, capacity building pipelines. Where do these pipelines start? Do they start at primary school? Do they start at high school? Do they start beyond academia? Then we look very specifically at training. Obviously, there's a need for a lot of training. And I think also very importantly, change management. And so these are the kind of things we need to address when we talk about normifying norms, something like that. Then in terms of the related processes, I think we need to focus on the issues around governance and to a large extent also transparency in trying to address this. And then finally, in terms of the technology, while one doesn't necessarily have to advocate for large-scale, very expensive chip production facilities. That's not what I'm getting at. But there is a need, particularly in the global south, to develop the tech sector in the sense of, for example, in cybersecurity, we need to develop a cybersecurity economic solution subsector where young people below 35 years of age can be gainfully employed. And what this does is that it brings home the ownership of these challenges and therefore the ownership of the norms in a way I think nothing else can. You find that economics, money, drives a lot of things. So if suddenly you find out that you have a relatively robust digital economy and these norms can positively impact it, then you actually have an enlightened self-interest to be able to or to need to adopt, in fact participate in the development of these norms, so that you tend to have a broader ownership across the various processes. And one other factor I think, and again I think this applies across the world, but I think particularly in the global south, we need to do a much better job of taking along 50% of our population, and that is our women. We cannot be talking about these norms, we cannot be implementing them, we cannot in fact do anything about cyberspace if it is not in some way, shape or form going to empower the unserved and the underserved in our economies. And so I think we do need to look at that. One challenge, though, in the process of developing norms, and this arises from some of the interventions on the chat, Connie and the others, is that you see, as we develop norms, we have to understand that we must factor the needs and aspirations of those who are not at the table. So, and who are those not at the table? Well, frankly, it's the unconnected, 3 billion of whom are generally spread across the global south. But and many of them are women, obviously. But another group that we must factor is actually the unborn. And the unborn are across the world, be they in the Netherlands or in the USA or in Africa. And so in terms of our thinking and our modeling and our planning, because whatever precedents we set today, they must live with them tomorrow. I'll stop here.
This is almost a perfect wrap up of the webinar, but I'll give a chance to Bart if you want a closing tweet also on your side.
Honestly, Vara, you should not have done that, because I think that statement was the best you could have had for concluding a webinar on norms and confidence building measures. But yeah, I mean, in line with what Abdul Hakim said, I think this is this will eventually define, let's say, how not just kind of, let's say, regional stability and peace and global peace and security around ICTs will develop over time, but it also defines how indeed new economies are digitalizing. And I talked a bit, let's say, in some of my questions about this part of the world and referring to Southeast Asia. I mean, on the other side of my continent are dozens of Pacific Island countries who have been connected to the internet, maybe only, let's say, in the last 10 years. And that's exactly where you see the same kind of dynamics that Abdul Hakim mentioned. Is are the countries actually ready, and are they willing to enter the digital environment as we know it in the Western world today, and which is not the nice and shiny internet that started, let's say, in the early 1990s. And so that's why trying to come to some kind of global consensus around what states should not be doing and should be doing, what non-state actors should and should not be doing, might be, I mean, a very long-term effort, but it's absolutely necessary to make sure that everyone can reap the benefits of the internet, which in the end is an economic and social goal and not a security goal.
Thanks, Bart. That was also quite comprehensive. If we can conclude this, that this is definitely not, and the norms and CBMs and the whole discussion about that we had in the last couple of webinars is certainly not something that is for diplomats only or for the governments. Even the shaping of the norms and the behavior is something that has to be very inclusive, geographically, stakeholder-wise, generationally-wise, gender-wise, as you mentioned. But then certainly the implementation is something that definitely needs to involve all the different actors, and that might be one of the messages or takeaways from this webinar. Gentlemen, thank you a lot for your participation today. I enjoyed the discussion. I think we could and we should continue this. A quick wrap up or reminder that the summary and video recording from the previous 3 webinars on cyber-armament, on applicability of international law to cyberspace, and on the traceability and attribution of cyber attacks are available on Diplo's website. So this one, recording and summary from this webinar, will be available within the next couple of days as well. So with that, we sort of wrap up the discussion within this context of cyber diplomacy for the moment, but I'm sure we'll continue in some future. What is also worth mentioning is that in December we are having the first meeting of the next or the current group of governmental experts taking place, and also the consultations, the open-ended working group. So we hope that these discussions and summaries can be helpful to all of you and anyone else who wants to be and should be involved in the discussion, starting from the UN level and certainly on the regional and multi-stakeholder levels as well. At the end, I need to thank again to Microsoft for supporting the whole initiative, well, I do hope that I'll meet some of you at the Internet Governance Forum next week in Berlin. There'll be a couple of discussions on cyber norms, on cyber, on peace and security in general, and cybersecurity. We will, for those of you that will not be at the IGF, also for those of you that might be at the IGF, but you can't follow everything, Diplo will be doing the reporting from all the sessions at the IGF almost in real time. So you can just visit the Digital Watch Observatory. We'll share the link in the chat window and follow the discussions. And well, certainly let us know if we can support any of the efforts to get more involved into the discussions, whether within the UN or the others. We'll be happy to support. Thank you, gentlemen, again for joining today. Well, Bart, good night at your side. Abdul Hakim, I hope to see you sometime soon. Thank you, everyone, for following, and well, see you some next occasion. Bye-bye.